cover as well. Creative being in the neoliberal classroom. So there's lots in there that we're really looking forward to hearing about. So Carol works at the Institute of Education and leads the PGC in art design there. We have met several times over the years, various conferences, and also in editing the International Journal of Art Design and Education. So I'm going to hand over to Carol.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. So my book, as it's on the screen there, is a response to my PhD study that I completed during lockdown 2020. And the study took the form of an arts-based ethnographic inquiry that took place over approximately 9 months. I worked with 5 different teachers in 4 different schools in the Midlands and the Southwest, all of whom had prior differing engagement with artist-teacher practice, and I simply asked them to make their own art, whether that was visual, material, digital, conceptual, relational, didn't matter what form, what method they used, and to make it present in their classroom somehow. My aim was to try and move the discourse surrounding the artist-teacher away from questions of identity, who or what an artist-teacher is, towards what the potential for artist-teacher practice might be in the classroom, with a particular emphasis on secondary education in England. And the 3 questions that the study asked were: what can the turn to the ideal of artist-teacher practice in England at the beginning of the 21st century reveal about contemporary experiences of teachers and students in schools? So there was the artist-teacher scheme. There was a scheme that was begun around the turn of the century, funded by Arts Council England, facilitated by the National Society for Education and Art Design. It was very particular to the UK. No other country had that kind of idea. That the aims of it really were that by encouraging arts teachers in schools to re-engage with their own arts practice, that somehow they would become better art teachers. But how and exactly what might happen as a result were kind of very vague. Second question was: what ways of being does classroom-oriented artist-teacher practice model and make possible? Then finally, what is it that classroom-oriented artist-teacher practice still has the potential to do? And so the participants in my study, I visited all of them in their classrooms at least once, some of them twice, and one particular school, the main school, I visited once a week, every week, and just observed what was going on in the lessons in the department during that time. And also because one of the particular aspects of models of artist-teacher CPD, particularly in the Midlands, I should say, I used to run an artist-teacher MA at Birmingham School of Art and facilitate the artist-teacher scheme in Birmingham as well. And one of the particular models of that was the opportunity for teachers to work with artists in developing their own practice. So I also, part of the study, arranged for an artist to visit the teachers in their classrooms and work with them for a short period of time. So, today I want to draw out some of, not all, but some of the things I consider in the final chapter of my book, which kind of ends with this conclusion: that artist-teacher practice holds open a space of playful inquiry to which the order of art and design education may be reconfigured, bringing minor relations and ways of being to the fore. It resists the instrumentalism of art and design education to prepare people to have an expectation of an aesthetic life. Now, I may have bitten off more than I can chew in the time that we've got, but I'll do my best. Okay, so the title of the book actually is inspired by a passage in Pen Dalton's Gendering of Art and Design, of Art Education. And Pen Dalton's Gendering of Art Education concerns itself with what she refers to as the invisibility of the average girl in the histories of art and design education. That's her starting point. And this passage is actually a passage that she cites, so it appears in David Thistlewood's book, Histories in Art Design Education. where he's discussing the different approaches of the National Society of Art Masters and the Art Teachers Guild to teaching their students. What he neglects to tell the reader, that Pen Dalton points out, is the National Society of Art Masters was a society of male teachers, teaching predominantly male students, and that the Art Teachers Guild, on the other hand, was female teachers teaching predominantly female students. And he ends by saying the Art Teachers Guild, on the other hand, was much more concerned with tactical approaches necessary for encouraging an essential creativity in children not specifically destined for an aesthetic way of life. It's worth considering for a moment what an aesthetic way of life might actually point to. Eisner describes aesthetic as follows. He kind of describes it by defining its opposite. So an anesthetic suppresses feeling, it dulls the senses, it renders you numb to feeling. What is aesthetic heightens feeling. What is aesthetic is pervaded by an emotional tone made possible by the process of being engaged in a work of art. So I would suggest that an aesthetic life is one of heightened encounter with the world, that engagement with art facilitates, through affecting and moving us to take notice, to intervene, to grow beyond the boundaries of what we've previously been. And to have no expectation of an aesthetic life is therefore to be dulled to the world, to be restricted to existing ways of being, to not be able to imagine difference in any way at all. Dalton emphasises that the gendering of art education is not simply about the demographics of those who teach and study art, but is to do with the feminisation of the curriculum subject, in which there is no expectation that the subject of art itself has an aesthetic life that is going to affect and change and open up difference and different ways of being. Published in 2001, Dalton's book precedes the era of austerity politics and the acceleration of neoliberal control measures in English schools, but she writes that the hidden and masculine force of the corporatisation of education that restricts the role of the teacher and the subject to that of a feminised, submissive, compliant service worker. The thrust of Dalton's book is not that art should return to its masculine industrial days, in which, as the quote on the previous slide shows, that the aesthetic life of girls wasn't valued. But she instead proposes that those who care for art education should resist its domestication and co-option into servicing corporate power. Her book is an encouragement to find ways to be present in places and spaces that refute the framing of the subject as just for girls, concerned only with interior, decorative and compliant ways of being. So hold that thought about Pen Dalton and the aesthetic way of life, because I'll return to it. So in turning my attention to the classroom, I had to kind of find a way to frame the classroom. You know, how was I approaching the classroom? And there were these three particular theorists or texts that were very influential in my understanding of what I was seeing in the classrooms that I was spending time in. The first one that was particularly important paper in my book was The Eternal Return of Teaching at the Time of the Corporation by Thompson and Cook. And in this book they refer to classrooms as being events that are formed by phenomena they talk about oscillating, returning flows of the far away and the close by. So the far away might be policy change, might be the requirement of the multi-academy trust heads to produce endless data, to collect data, and then the close by, the more responsive movements that happen in the classroom in response in the moment to students, to colleagues, to objects, to materials that you're engaging with. And multiple oscillations happen within the classroom, and these oscillations ensure that every day is different, so every day has a different combination of far away and close by flows, but because they're constantly returning, every day is also reassuringly a return of the same. And that's what makes teaching such a great profession to be in. This kind of every day is different. You never know what you're going to get when you wake up in the morning, but at the same time there's this repetitive rhythm of, you know, the timetable, the alarms going at the end of lessons and break times and so on. Which brings me on to Udell and Armstrong's Politics Beyond Subjects. They talk about classrooms being formed of a choreography. So a literal choreography, as I was just saying, in terms of the movement of bodies within the school. If you kind of think about your average secondary school with hundreds of students, it's a miracle really that they function on a daily basis, and that's to do with the choreography of schooling. And the pandemic showed when that choreography was interrupted and everybody suddenly had to go online, how lost everybody felt without that kind of just habitual way of being in the school together. The choreography is also informed by policy, by the faraway flows that Thompson and Cook refer to. They talk about it even at a molecular level, kind of a kind of biological process. You know, things like digestion, menstruation, sweating going on in a classroom with, you know, multiple bodies all going through their own movements. And then finally Jane Bennett. Now Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter doesn't refer to schools, doesn't refer to classrooms, but her political ecology of things became a helpful way for me to consider the classroom, particularly the final chapters of my book. So I put political in brackets for good reason. Cambridge Dictionary defines politics as the relationships within a group or organisation that allow particular people to have power over others. Wikipedia defines politics as a set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups or other forms of power relations among individuals, such as the distribution of resources or status. So the politics of schooling that we're all aware, particularly over the last 10 years, I mean, art and design as a curriculum subject has always had this kind of vulnerable position in the curriculum, I guess, but particularly over the last 10 years with the EBAC, with the whole facilitating subjects debacle with, you know, people like Nicky Morgan making speeches about students not restricting their life chances by studying the arts. But, you know, we're aware of the impact of that in terms of the status of art and design as a subject in school. This distributed, so what this is to do with agency, this is to do with who has power. I want to take a Spinozian perspective on agency here as simply the capacity to affect or be affected, which suggests that power is not to be found inside human beings, but in the connections and relationships between humans and non-humans. Agency is a shared endeavour. This distributed understanding of agency is described by Bennett as being like an ecosystem in which confederations of organisms may come together to make big things happen. So the political ecology of the classrooms in my study challenged the flows and the choreography of classrooms in particular ways that were both firstly instrumentalising, so everybody and everything had a particular pace and a particular purpose. You know, so if during a lesson a student was encountered in a corridor, it's like, where are you supposed to be? Return to where you're supposed to be, to your ideal path. But more than that, the objects themselves in the classroom, so every glue stick, every paintbrush, every pencil was instrumentalised in the teacher's mind for being for a particular outcome. And this makes sense because schools have budgets, and you need to manage your budgets, you need to care for materials for long term, so it helps to know, well, these set of oil pastels are going to be for year 8, this project, and the watercolour paints are for teaching landscape painting, and a set of pencils are for teaching students how to shade a hyperreal copy of a photograph, for example. Everything has its particular point and purpose. But also the agency of the classroom was directional. It was towards, I would argue, this concept of the ideal neoliberal citizen, independently and economically enterprising and economically productive. So it was a political ecology in which some ways of being were valued over other ways of being. which I'll explain. And in a sense that the ways of being that were valued were making it increasingly difficult to care for the close by. So to return to Thompson and Cook, they say that the classroom is formed of these oscillations of the far away and the close by, and they draw on Deleuze's work, Postscript on Societies of Control, which is a response to a paper by Foucault, and where they foretell the emergence of what they call a new apparatus of control. And within this new apparatus of control, they suggest that the duty of care, the ability to care for the close by, is challenged. Disciplinary institutions are handed over to the corporation, so this kind of echoes what Pen Dalton was saying about the kind of becoming a service worker, servicing the corporation. Disciplinary institutions handed over to the corporation are open the sites of enclosure, so a school previously, the aim of the school was to give students and teachers, take them away from the market. It was a place where the needs of the market were left outside. So, these sites of enclosure that once kept individuals removed from the risks of the market are now opened up to marketisation. And the school becomes a place of scrutiny rather than simply surveillance, where the individual, no longer cared for as an individual person, just becomes data, continually processed, producing more data through which their position and potential are constantly modulated to meet externally set criteria. In the main school that I spent most of my time, this kind of data collection was just overwhelming. It happened on a lesson by lesson basis. Merits and demerits and uniform points and lateness points were immediately fed through to the tutor, with flashes on the screen. Somebody in your tutor group has got 3 demerits, therefore they are coming at lunchtime for a 10-minute detention. The care for the students was reframed around this being responsive to the data. And not only that, but then of course every 6 weeks the school was required to set a test that produced work which had to be graded in 3 bands, bronze, silver and gold, and only a certain number of students were allowed to be in each band. So I witnessed endless discussions about virtually identical pieces of work. Which one are we going to put in the bronze? Which one's going to be in the silver? This wasn't being responsive to the individual, this was being responsive to the requirement to produce the data in the form that the senior management required. So Thompson and Cook say that prevented from caring in ways that are recognisable to the teacher as teaching, and perhaps no longer feeling cared for themselves in these, so not only are the students controlled by the data, but of course the students' data then comes back to inform how the teacher is seen by their heads department, by their senior management. It kind of affects whether they meet their own targets and so on. So perhaps no longer feeling cared for themselves, it becomes harder for the teacher to enact the to and fro of the close by and the far away, because it just feels like there's only the far away, there's only these endless returns of the far away. Endless waves of policy and data to respond to, and they suggest therefore that the equilibrium of the classroom is disrupted. So in my study, the vulnerability of the teacher became a concern very, very early on. I mean, I already was concerned at the ethics stage when I didn't want to add any more stress. I knew teaching was a stressful profession. But having got through the ethics stage, I then began to approach teachers to ask if they would be interested in being involved in the study. As I say, used to run the Artist Teacher Scheme in Birmingham, so I started by approaching alumni of my courses. And then I also approached other course leaders around the country for their recommendations and followed up some of the people that they suggested as well. And what amazed me was the numbers of the alumni from artist teachers courses who actually had left teaching. Or if they hadn't left teaching, were unsure about committing to being part of the study because they weren't sure they would be by the time that the study would begin. So that kind of set a tone right from the beginning. And then I recruited the 5 teachers. Within a month of the study happening, one of them decided to leave her job. And then in September, two teachers that were both part-time, both in separate schools, returned to work to find that their heads of department had gone off long-term sick with stress, and they had both had to step up to be acting heads of department. So this kind of sense of the vulnerability of the art teacher in terms of the stress of being in the role became this kind of this theme that went on through. Claire Penketh is able to apply concepts from the field of disability studies to art and design education because of what she calls a shared otherness and vulnerability within neoliberal education policy. She draws on the concept of epistemic invalidation from disability studies. So epistemic invalidation is the sense in which one's ways of being in and with the world are not recognised or valued by the majoritarian ways of being in the world. This is characterised by lack of recognition of both current but also potential ways of being. So both disabled children and art and design education, she argues, are seen as excessive in an educational climate that prioritises economic productivity. So thinking back to what I was saying, Nicky Morgan's speech about not limiting your choices by studying the arts, the EBAC, the concept of facilitating subjects. This is all about kind of art and design as a curriculum subject, not quite meeting the mark in terms of being seen to be worthwhile within the neoliberal concepts. Neither the disabled students nor art education are seen to serve the current or future needs of the market well. To be noticed and validated, Penketh concludes, a subject with both meanings of the world, both being a person but also the subject of art design, must be perceived to have economic worth and potential. Now, in every single classroom that I visited during my study, but also possibly every single classroom I visit in my current role at UCL, there were rather elaborate displays about the creative industries. And talking to the teachers about them and why they were there, it was all part of an effort to convince students and their parents of the economic worth of the subject. So one way that artist-teacher practice is framed within this neoliberal context in which the teacher feels vulnerable, feels that they're constantly having to prove themselves and the worth of themselves, but also the worth of their subject, is as self-care. So it's something that my participants mentioned quite a bit about their motivations for why they participated in artist-teacher practice. One of the participants was a frequent participant in the National Sketchbook Circle, which is often kind of marketed as self-care for the art teacher. I want to problematise this framing of artist-teacher practice as self-care through drawing. In my book, this section is very long, but I'm just going to refer to Jagodinsky's The Hijacking of Creativity here. He talks about the way that neoliberal creativity propels us towards differentiation. It's the creativity that we must engage with in order to be seen as a valuable person. But it's transcendental, meaning that it's something that we look for outside ourselves in order to fill a lack, a deficit in ourselves. We must continually be reaching after our potential, no longer of inherent value because of who we are, but because of what we're working on. So all of the teachers in my study had performance management targets that they were having to aim towards. And in fact, one of the students, one of the teachers, had engaging in artist-teacher practice as one of her targets, that she was supposed to be working on. Past achievements, such as having been an artist first, so to use James Dation's book, The Artist Teacher, is quite often on the bookshelves of people who are interested in artist-teacher practice. His main definition of artist-teacher, what an artist-teacher is, that they're just somebody that was an artist first, somebody who's entered teaching through having a specialist degree in art, first of all, and then that gives them an artistic sensibility somehow when they're in the classroom. But past achievements, such as being an artist first, lose their currency within the neoliberal context, because one must continually be increasing and demonstrating one's achievements and future worth in order to be recognised. So it's interesting to consider the role of artist-teacher CPD within that. To what extent is it implicated in this neoliberal drive for differentiating oneself, to be a better person, a better art teacher? To what extent is being an artist teacher simply a way of, standing out from somebody who is just an art teacher? And what is the difference between somebody who's just an art teacher and somebody who claims to be an artist teacher? So, Foucault proposed that what was needed in response to regimes of power was a process of critique that injected creative potential into instrumentalised ways of being, not being free, but engaging in practices of freedom. He used the Greek concept care of oneself, and specifically refers to Socrates' dialogue with the young Alcibiades, who aspired to be a governor. And Alcibiades asked, "What is this self I must take care of? In order to be able to take care of the others, I must govern properly." Self-care was for Foucault, the requisite for living ethically in a neoliberal context. It was the difference between being active or passive as a subject. And though he spoke of this critical care of the self as the art, though he spoke of the critical care of the self as art, the language used relates more closely, I think, to the practice of craft, particularly as it's defined in the classic text by Pai, who describes craft as workmanship of risk as opposed to workmanship of certainty. And these sentiments are evident in Thompson's discussion of Foucault's work, where he contrasts the idea of self-formation with self-fabrication. So he says self-formation is not self-fabrication. To produce something is to impose static form upon recalcitrant matter, to stamp being into becoming, like kind of you're just being made by a machine. To manufacture oneself as a product, to merely fabricate oneself would thus be nothing other than rendering oneself pliant to the standards of experimentation, calculation, exchange and consumption embodied in the regimes of governmental technologies. So this is kind of partly why I have concerns about the notion of self-care, artist-teacher practice as being self-care. If I had time, I would kind of talk a little bit about one of the works of one of the artist teachers and something she said about going to see a therapist, and the therapist telling her that her problem was she didn't have any hobbies. She was too busy, she didn't have any hobbies, as if the problem was in herself rather than in the system that was requiring her. And in that regard, just dutifully taking up a hobby is literally kind of just being a willing participant in this system. Rather than a practice, Thompson cautions that self-critique and formation, rather than compliant fabrication, takes courage. Rather than a practice of escape, safety and ease, self-care from Foucault's perspective requires hard work, vulnerability and active engagement with the world. And framed this way, the act of taking up paper and pens and just simply doodling, as one of the participants in my project did, when she shared it with me, she said, I can't remember what the exact phrase was, but it's just doodling. I wasn't sure whether to share them, and I noticed over time that pretty much every one of my participants, when they shared their work with me, it was always preceded by it's just, or it's only, this kind of ambivalence about whether it could be called art at all, whether what they were engaging with could be called a practice. And this sense in which practice that they were engaging with, in their minds, always fell short of being art. It was always less than art somewhere. So framed this way, the act of just taking up pens and paper to doodle might actually be seen as a courageous act, as well as a therapeutic one, demonstrating a creative desire to connect and to counter the lack of care within school as part of the society of control. So to return to Foucault's question that Alcibiades asked, what is the self I must take care of in order to be able to take care of others, I must govern properly. Foucault suggests that this turns the therapeutics of self-care into a matter of responsibility for one's relations with others, rather than simply care for oneself. The question can be reframed, I think, in the context of art design education. What must be taken care of so that all made possible by the arts and design classroom may continue to live fully creative and well? And I think that this is the kind of underlying question of artist-teacher practice, even in its very minor, less than iterations that were the predominant ones that I saw during my study. And I would suggest that the answer to that question is that what must be taken care of is the work of art. We talk a lot about a child-centred classroom, a teacher-centred classroom. What if the work of art was made central? What would the work of art ask for, demand? So the question that I kind of pose in my final chapter is, how does caring for the work of art through artist-teacher practice challenge instrumentalised relations and give potential to new ways of being in the classroom? So I'm going to talk through, I've got so many works of artistic practice that my participants engaged with, and I had to kind of restrict it, so I decided I would just talk through the work of just one of the participants, who in my book is called Zoe. So Log, and I don't have a photograph of Log, so you're just going to have to imagine it. So we're going to have a room full of different logs being imagined in everyone's heads. Log was cut from a tree in the garden of the house Zoe grew up in. It was planted by her dad when she was born, and he had died a few years ago, and now her sister and her family were living in the house. And they wanted to cut the tree down, so they asked her permission. It wasn't particularly special to Zoe, but she took a section of the tree with the idea of making something from it, and this became Log. Zoe's dad was an art teacher too, and an artist, and she thought he would have liked that. He kept lots of sketchbooks over the years with a combination of his own work and ideas for school projects, and Zoe had been looking through some of them, and she'd been wondering if she should use them, and maybe the log somehow was a starting point for her own work. She was currently doing an artist-teacher MA. She'd had a few ideas about the log. She thought she might slice it, perhaps take some prints from the slices, and she started to cut it, but then she wasn't sure. And she was still wondering what she could do with it. So she just took it into her classroom, and it was on her desk at the front of the classroom next to her computer where she took the register. And she reported to me that students would come up and just absent-mindedly stand there and stroke the log while she was talking to them, and some of them even bent down and smelt it. But gradually, over time, every now and then, one of them would say, "Miss, what's this?" And she said they wanted to know why it was here. I told them exactly why, which I wouldn't have done otherwise, and they instantly were like, "Oh, we totally get that." And a lot of them were saying, "What are you going to do with it? Are you going to carve your dad's face into it?" And I replied, "I don't know that I'm going to do that with it, but that's right, what am I going to do with it?" And the other teachers noticed it, and it was like, I've had some really interesting conversations about your log. I just love that final statement. But what was interesting were the kind of conversations that the log opened up. The sharing of experiences of grief and loss. So the students, talking about their grandparents or even parents that had died. Other experiences of, having objects and not being sure what to do with them. That kind of blurred the boundaries of the normal ways of being in the classroom, but in a safe way. The log became a safe, ethical space that kind of expanded what was enabled to be talked about and made perceptible in the classroom. And in my book, I kind of talk about other instances of published artist-teacher practice that had the same dynamic to them. Included in Zoe's conversations with her students and colleagues about what should be done with the log were small offerings of personal information about their own experiences of loss and memorial. Now, Zoe was adamant that the log was not therapy for her, or her students, or her colleagues. She'd also been exploring copying out sections of her dad's sketchbook at home. He'd had an accident in his youth that had forced him to learn to write again with his opposite hand, and she challenged herself to do the same. And those works she didn't take into the classroom. And she said the reason why she didn't take those into the classroom was because it was like it became something. It was about me remembering Dad, and it didn't have anything to say to anyone else. By implication, the log that she chose to take into the classroom did have something to say to other people. Now, back to Bennett's political ecology. Rancière defined a politics of aesthetics as determining what presents itself. Like Foucault, he conceives of subjectivation as moulded by powerful flows, which he names the police. And the police operate to partition what is sensible, what is able to be perceived, to be seen, understood and spoken about. Another way of saying that only some ways of being are recognisable and therefore validated. And such partitioning, he discusses, creates a community of sense, or perhaps another word for choreography or an ecology, that brings certain things together as being possible in a time and place, and ensures that everything and everyone has its place and is not out of place. As Lewis emphasises, the sensible acknowledges the power of the aesthetic, that which effectively propositions and provides a way to talk about the role of art in redistributing what is sensible. I would argue that that's what log did. It was a moment of redistributing what was able to be sensed in the classroom. He states that art blurs boundaries between what can and cannot be said, can and cannot be seen, thus expanding, reconfiguring, hybridising, mixing notions of what is common to a community. Therefore, if the work of art becomes present as a third thing, so he uses his phrase as the third thing, in the classroom, drawing others to be present also and to attend to it, it may disturb professional boundaries and entangle the community of the classroom in divergent ways. And this reminds me of Atkinson's description of his encounter in the 1990s during the BSE crisis, where a student was preparing an examination piece completed in 10 hours at school under controlled conditions. She proposed to her teacher the idea of adapting a wooden cage by suspending within it, over a pile of straw, it's really difficult to imagine this, I know, laid over a map of England, a cow's slowly defrosting heart. And Atkinson speaks about the encounter as being an example of real learning, prompted by both student and teacher, being forced by the proposition of the work to question. And in the situation, everybody was disorientated. It didn't fit easily within the exam criteria. And so, it disrupted what was sensible and pulled everyone out of place by working through the potential of the work of art. And that was a student's piece of work, whereas log was something that was brought into the classroom situation by the teacher through their own practice. So in my final chapter, I kind of moved from Bennett's ecology of practice to talk about the notion of the heterotopia. So the heterotopia was an idea that Foucault actually didn't really speak much about. It's amazing how little he spoke about it, considering how much other people have since spoken about it. But Foucault speaks of the heterotopia as a place where it's kind of out of place and out of time somehow, where the normal rules of engagement are temporarily suspended. And so the examples he comes up with are things like cruise ships, circuses, but also cemeteries, places where people are allowed to be dead. Also psychiatric hospitals as well. Foucault first referenced heterotopia in the preface to The Order of Things, where he was discussing a Chinese encyclopedia that classified the world in unusual ways. It categorised, for example, animals differently. We might classify them as mammals, invertebrates, or whatever, but this Chinese encyclopedia had another way of classifying them. And this association with categorisation and ordering is significant for education because of the way, within the school, the instrumentalism of the curriculum, the way that as I was describing at the beginning, the kind of materials of the classroom are organised and classified as being for particular purposes. Soja describes heterotopia as disturbing the order by throwing everything up in the air. And this might suggest an accidental, indiscriminate throwing into disarray. However, the intentional positioning implied by the word emplacement, as Johnson notes, is used to describe heterotopia 20 times in the opening paragraph of Foucault's Different Spaces. The word emplacement suggests that heterotopia have purpose, attending to redistributing, reassembling, and making sensible particular relations in particular places. So heterotopic disarray is attentive to particularities, providing a way of asking, so what do we have here then? This attentiveness to what is there helps to expose the ground that everything is growing from. So in the second chapter of my book, I talk about thirdness in response to Winnicott's object relations. I emphasise the importance of play as a third space within which humans and non-humans are released from their instrumentalised relations. And playfulness is characterised as often requiring openness, absent-mindedness, but also, like the heterotopia, potentially dangerous, and therefore requiring boundaries within which it's safe to play. Beginning there at, sorry, I've just noticed that something's been cut off my notes. I can't tell you who says this, unfortunately, because it's off my notes, but somebody begins their analysis of heterotopia with ancient Greek festivals or holy days, from which we get the English word holiday, as the times and spaces when activities not part of the public or private realms took place. What I want to argue is that artist-teacher practice is a kind of heterotopic form of play. So it was interesting that participants in my study, the numbers of them began with just playing with materials that were to hand in their classrooms. So those materials that were instrumentalised for particular purposes through their artist-teacher practice had permission to be something else, to let's see what else we can do with these things. So in a very simple way, even if they didn't actually become anything, that kind of playful engagement was a way of interrupting, making sense of other ways of being. But it's prudent to understand that play is in place, to see it as being purposeful and therefore ultimately careful. And if I had time, I was going to talk about Claire's work over here in her Centre for Creative Explorations, because I think Claire's work is a really excellent example of what I'm talking about in terms of artist-teacher practice that engages the teacher but also the students in practices that are playful but careful and open up alternative ways of being as a result. De Courter and De Haan note that the Greek word skol, from which we get the English word school, originally meant free time, without labour, work or action. And they suggest that the heterotopic time is also anti-economical, the time of sacrifice, gift, play and squandering. This dynamic is also emphasised by those sympathetic to post-critical pedagogy. So Mashlin and Simons, for example, describe school as free from the rhythm of the productive world, describing the teacher as being a freed slave. So school is rarely depicted as a place where the teacher is free, and certainly I'm not sure any of the teachers in my study would have described themselves as free. But this perspective helps to make sense of the dynamic that I became aware of through my time spent in the study, that the teachers often clearly enjoyed experimenting with lots of different practices, rather than devoting themselves to just one line of inquiry. And at times I felt really conflicted by this. The interactions were playful, but they also seemed safe and often quite indiscriminate. And whereas I was wanting them, as this is perhaps with me with my higher education teacher hat on, well, if you just kind of read a little bit more in relation to that, and I would suggest things that they might want to look at, which they just ignored. If you develop that a little bit further, that could be a really interesting line of inquiry. But no, they're just moving on to the next thing. So Bella described, was one of the participants. She decided having play days, and she would, just sign up for any old course that was going. Just do it and then move on to the next one. It was expressed by Julie, another participant, who said, "I've realised that I just really like trying lots of different things." So that could be meaning that I flip between things, a lot in a negative way. Or that could be a positive thing, I don't really know. I definitely think my enjoyment of trying lots of new things has increased since entering teaching. So, Machlin and Simons go on to, just checking I'm on the right slide, is there? They discuss their view of the teacher as being a freed slave, that perhaps is quite utopian. Obviously, the teachers they're imagining are given lots of free time to engage in these playful practices, and pay is generous and keeps in line with inflation and so on. But actually they do, in one statement in their book, they do consider what happens to what they call their amateurish enthusiasm in contexts where love for the subject is surrendered to productivity. They say the only time left for occupying oneself with love for teaching is the free time claimed outside of working hours. For the self-liberating teacher, assigned reading becomes vacation reading, thorough lesson planning becomes a weekend pastime. The time for amateurism is exiled to evenings, nights, weekends and holidays. And in my experience of running artist teacher CPD courses, that just defines the experience of my participants. So in this light, they're just dabbling examples of artist-teacher practice that are profiled throughout the book, become acts of loving care for the subject of art seized in their own moments of free time that do exist. So I want to end by talking about Zoe's work that she made for her final exhibition of her MA. Amongst the participants in my study, Zoe was the only one currently participating in any artist-teacher courses within a university context. And my visits to see her involved time observing and participating in her classroom, but also inevitably spending time with the work she was creating as part of her MA, discussing together how it was developing and where it might go next. And within these conversations, she often reflected on who within her workplace and the university she felt most understood or recognised her practice. So in school, this was a teaching assistant she spent a lot of time with, and in the university it was a fellow student. And she expressed frustration that in the university context there were times when she felt pitied for the untenable situation she was assumed to be in as a teacher in the neoliberal classroom. Some tutors and peers who were not teachers unwittingly communicated that the classroom was an undesirable place for her to be, whereas in fact she found her practice as an art teacher a compelling context for arts research, as well as a job that she enjoyed and was committed to. So despite the stresses caused by her head of department being absent long-term with stress and stepping up to fill the role herself, though Zoe felt there was momentum in the work she was pursuing, she didn't always feel that that momentum was recognised by those who encountered it in the university context. They didn't always seem to understand what it was that the work wanted or needed. So as I said, Zoe's parents have both been art teachers, and as part of her module on the histories of art design education on her MA course, she'd been studying her father's old sketchbooks, which included his own artwork as well as his ideas for projects in school. And these became a resource from which she started to make work. She managed to work out some of the locations that he'd drawn, and she returned to those locations. She moulded large sheets of wet paper over rocks he had drawn and took rubbings of them, and used the same process in school of worn surfaces that showed traces of past encounters, for example, desks bearing the marks of years of craft knives and biros engraving their surfaces. Her interest in forgotten personal histories of art education led her to visit the National Art Education Archive at Yorkshire Sculpture Park. Where as well as encountering many artefacts, she spoke to two retired art teachers, so two living artefacts, I guess, in the archive, that were now volunteering at the archive. They'd both been previous heads of art, and they volunteered there. And Zoe's conversations about the archive and her time spent with the volunteers were not just enthusiastic, but validating. So she said They were showing me prints that they'd made or their students had made. They just talked with such warmth about their whole careers. They did it in a way through their prints, so it was really nice thinking about some of the changes that had happened for them. Sometimes really simple things, like they'd been there before the GCSEs and after, and just going through and having a real conversation about that got me thinking about what I do. Mixed up in her encounters in the archive was this sense of being recognised that she didn't necessarily feel she was getting in the university. The material investigation she'd been doing, prompted by her investigations of her dad's sketchbooks, ended up being kind of turned into a three-dimensional cube-like construction, and there's just a little bit of it there. Circular prints developed from rubbings she collected were brought together with images inspired by her students' playful photographing of their hands holding objects in her classroom. These became large repetitive motifs on lengths of paper stretched across the different sides of the cube. And we were encouraged to kind of go in and through them and around them. And it felt, moving through them, there was something that felt a bit like the rolling of the dice. The kind of circles were kind of like, a bit like dots on the dice. Reflecting on her work after seeing it, alongside my notes and our conversations about her research and encountering the work in development, I was struck by these two contrasting narratives in my own response. One from the work of art in the exhibition was about movement, variability, instability, and the other from the archive and her response to it appeared to be about the opposite, about fixity, consistency and anchorage. And in probing this contradiction further, I began to look at Foucault's framing of the archive as a heterotopia and Deleuze and Guattari's theorising of art and the people yet to recognise. Foucault's theorising of the archive as being heterotopic resists compliance, fixity and homogeneity. He says it's a place instead of creativity, openness and contingency. His understanding of the archive doesn't preserve, but opens up other possibilities, other ways of cataloguing. It's not to say that the museum, with its history and the plunder and objectification of other people and places of difference, is not implicated in the reproduction of majoritarian discourses, but instead, through playful and ethical heterotopic practice, the museum can be remade to announce a people or ways of being previously unrecognised within its relations. So, an accessible exposition of Deleuze and Guattari's work about people to come that I recommend is provided by Schultz in her comparative text about Heidegger and Deleuze. As she discusses, both philosophers are inspired by Paul Klee's writing on art, particularly his reflections on his childlike abstract work, and Paul Klee talks of that work as missing a people. And both use that as a springboard to discuss the work of art as gathering and making public a people for itself. It's an interest grounded in their shared consideration of how something new is brought into being by art. Heidegger, who preceded Deleuze, referred to art as gathering a people, but this appears in his writing as a retrieval of finding something lost, as the people he describes come into being through taking up a history that they've become disconnected from, which is made new by the work of art. And this might be one way of understanding Zoe's finding of her people in the account she gave in the archive, and her investigations informed by her father's sketchbooks. However, Heidegger's more than contentious sympathies with Nazism show how such an understanding of a people potentially leads to nationalistic and essentialist thinking and can be problematic. And Schultz refers to the following passage by Deleuze and Guattari, who address Heidegger's connections to Nazism when they write that Heidegger lost his way. He got the wrong people, earth and blood. For the race summoned forth by art or philosophy is not the one that claims to be pure, but is rather an oppressed, bastard, lower, anarchical, nomadic and irremediably minor race. Artaud said to write for the literate, to speak for the aphasic, to think for the acephalous. But what does for mean? It is not for their benefit, or yet in their place. It is before. It is a question of becoming. They propose an alternative way to consider the people given potential through the work of art. This is a perspective that helps to reframe Zoe's archival study as a space of encounter through which art education is met as open and contingent. The people Deleuze and Guattari describe are those who speak minor languages, whose ways of being are characterised by hybridity and have no clear place of origin. For Deleuze and Guattari, art does not speak instead of such a people, but announces them as arriving and participates in their invention. Schultz contrasts the homogeneity implied in Heidegger's becoming a people through taking up a history with the openness to difference, contingency and the future enabled by Deleuze's claim that art must take part in this task of contributing to the invention of a people. The question to be considered in response to the notion of announcing or inventing a people is who are the people that artist, teacher, practice announces? Deleuze and Guattari speak of the people as being already here, coming into being with the work. So who might they be? In relation to education, Carlin and Wallin, applying a Deleuze-Guattarian lens to education, emphasise the directionality of the classroom, much like I do in the beginning of my book, towards the ideal, independent, productive, neoliberal human being. There's much of worth in Wallin's exploration of curriculum theory and the people yet to come, but I'm interested here in his 2015 essay, in which he talks about the people in school being absent, as he uses the phrase, the teachers are missing. In the context of education, he suggests if anyone is to rise to the task of announcing the arrival of minor ways of being within the entangled classroom, so that they can claim an equality and become public, it must be the teacher. If the teacher is also missing, overwhelmed by compliance, worn down by the control measures of the neoliberal classroom, becoming acephalous and asphasic, unable to think. So acephalous means unable to think, and aphasic means unable to speak difference. Then as Wallin addresses, the institution of the school can be understood to be enacting a violence, not producing life, but something that falls short of what feels like a feasible life, a life overwhelmed by compliance, which is the experience of the teachers in my study. He describes a situation where education is offered, but with no expectation that those who are formed by its flows will have, to refer back to Pen Dalton's book, the expectation of an aesthetic life, either now or by implication in the future. What's not emphasised by Wallin in this particular essay, but is emphasised in the work he's written about elsewhere, is that Heidegger and Deleuze and Guattari both see art as essential, a central component in the invention of a people, rather than framing art as an inward-looking practice concerned with internalised ways of being, as is implied, I think, in the way that the subject is, and I kind of, in an earlier chapter of my book, I talk about the way that the subject is framed within the school curriculum as being very much about internalised ways of being. This assigns art education a significant responsibility to participate in announcing and making public minor discourses that resist the violence of majoritarian discourse. And this may be the art's primary role in schools, to be the spaces where, through teachers recognising this potential and holding open these playful spaces of thirdness, students' minor ways of being are enabled to become effectively present and equal with the work of art, to find out where and how they, the work of art, matter. The challenge that emerges from Wallin's critique, therefore, is that of the invention of a professional community of teachers who recognise the worth and have the expectation of creative, aesthetic ways of being. And it is arguably they who are first summoned by artist-teacher practice. It is only through they becoming effectively present that they might then extend that space of encounter to engage students in interactions through which their minor ways of being may be affirmed, find space to grow beyond the compliance and instrumentalism of the choreography of schooling. So my proposition is that the potential of artist-teacher practice to be more than, less than, only, just, alongside the compliant flows of the classroom, is as a third side practice through where preparing the teachers to recognise it contributes to the invention of a people yet to come who might recognise the worth of an aesthetic life. The knowledge of much artist-teacher practice as being less than just doodling or dabbling throughout my study might suggest that this is an exaggeration. After all, what kind of people and ways of being might possibly be enabled by such minor interactions? So just to finish, I want to refer to a really inspirational account of minor transactions preparing people to recognise, which is seen in Tambuku's exploration of first-hand historical accounts of pioneering university-associated women's colleges in the UK. She refers to these colleges as heterotopic, describing them as crisis heterotopias, spaces of transition and tension, and placements that gave refuge to women in crisis, within which the women were able to expand their space. In Tambuku's account, minor acts of freedom and resistance, such as drinking cocoa together in the evening or learning to row a boat, sit alongside the greater act of claiming the right to study, to thought, to creative intervention in the world. They're all part of the same experience. If, as Teague suggests, educational spaces produce compliance through mundane, everyday moments of teaching and learning, equally, in Tambuku's study, everyday, apparently mundane acts produce the opposite, being part of working out what claiming the freedom of studying at a women's college and being a thinking, feeling, alive woman in the world with an expectation of an aesthetic life might look and feel like. Also referring to minor practices, let's go back. Also referring to minor practices in the context of lost my place now. Significantly, Tambuku students' claim to an academic life is accompanied by these minor, cumulative minor claims to what might be seen in a broad sense to be an aesthetic life, to pleasure, sensation, connection to others, physical exercise, appreciation of nature, etc., to being affected. And this underlines what Rancière maintains, that the redistribution of the sensible is a political act. Outside the heterotopia of the women's colleges, a woman's right to an aesthetic life might still have been unthinkable, but inside, a people yet to come was being prepared, coming into being with the colleges themselves, beginning to recognise what was possible in the process. These minor potentialities, though fragile, may have gone unnoticed and been overlooked, but as Manning argues, this is the minor strength. So, as Schultz says, minor practices like this have the potential to draw people together. These practices are always localised, specific and transitory, because otherwise they risk becoming rigidified and absorbed back into the major. In other words, one of the characteristics of the minor is that it is always in process and becoming. Deleuzian people to come will have this in common: their exclusion from dominant systems, their excessiveness to any model, so thinking back to Claire Penketh and her comments about art education being excessive, perhaps their failure to live up to any model, so thinking about my artist teachers' kind of ambivalence about whether their practice was good enough to be art, and failure to live up to the model of art. The minor is deviant with respect to the majoritarian regime, and always connotes a disruption of the dominant system, but a productive, creative disruption. So, to finish then, I'm going to just move on. This is my kind of final conclusion of the book, that artist-teacher practice holds open a third site of ethically playful inquiry through which the order of art and design education may be reconfigured, bringing minor relations of ways of being to the fore, resist the instrumentalism of the art and design education to prepare people to have the expectation of an aesthetic life. And I've left so much out, but thank you ever so much for listening.
We have some time for questions now, so open to our audience to ask questions. I can see them all forming now. In terms of our All for the Arts approach for this year, this concept of heterotopia somehow relates to my description of the daily extraordinary within art, in that arts practice enables this space to not so much escape from the ordinary, but, as you say, to make it feasible. Do you think that has a relation to the way we've been reading artist-teacher practice?
Yeah, I think so. well, it's the ordinary, but also I think what's interesting because throughout the book I kind of profile my own participants, artist teacher practice, but I also profile the works of artist teachers that have been exhibited publicly that I've encountered, and then also works of artist teacher practice that have been written about as well, perhaps using it being theorised a little bit more than my kind of very tentative efforts of the participants in my study. And what's interesting is that this notion of everything being thrown up in the air, of everything being potentially important. It suddenly enables people, the teachers, to notice things kind of to the side that just aren't part of their normal everyday way. I think that's where Bennett's theorising of perception is quite helpful. Not so much in Vibrant Matter, but in her work that she writes, she does some research where she talks about hoarders, people that hoard objects, and who use phrases like, the objects, they're just called out to me, it's not got nothing to do with me, I'm just submitting to their call. That she writes about Heidegger's concept of ready to hand and present hands. The ready to hand is the objects that we just use every day without thinking about it. I think he uses the phrase, chairs allow us to sit, pens allow us to write. We don't notice them until they are broken or not quite the right size for us, and then suddenly they become present at hand. So she kind of, that suggests that objects enter our perception when there's something wrong with them. Bennett's writing about hoarders suggests perhaps also they might enter our perception when there's something wrong with us. That this notion that hoarders just are unable to filter out, because the instrumentalising of things is, as I kind of hope I made clear, has a good purpose, because we can't constantly be aware and alive to effectively to absolutely everything around us. It could be overwhelming. So the hoarders are somehow overwhelmed by their perception. But then also, she talks about, there's a lecture where I can't remember what university she's talking about, and in the lecture she does then also acknowledge that artists may be this special kind of person that are kind of midway between Heidegger and the hoarder in some way, and they're aware of effectively responding to things. So yeah, sorry, I feel like I've wandered off from your...
It's okay, it's your own wandering.
It's my own wandering, so yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Fascinating. Really great to hear about all those findings and wrapped around all that really interesting theory. There's so many themes going on. My question seems really prosaic and based on that, but I'm really interested in the process of doing of the research and kind of how many respondents and how many times did you meet them? Were these relationships built up?
So I started off with a pilot study, which is 2 teachers in one school. And the aim initially had been to work just with one art department over an extended period of time. And the pilot study was an opportunity for them and for me to test how that might develop. And myself and the teachers at the end of the pilot study felt it had been a really productive time, but the experience had been really intense for the teachers in the school. And I was, as I said, I was concerned not to add any more stress. So we then opened it up, and I had so many conversations, as I've said, with teachers potentially who are interested, and then, I'm not sure, I'm looking at changing jobs, I might be leaving my role. So in the end, I recruited 3 other art teachers who were spread around the Midlands and the South West. So the main school where I'd done the pilot study, I was able to visit once a week, every week for 9 months. And then the other schools, I'm trying to think, I think I visited each of their classrooms twice. One of them once, but then visited her at home the other time. And then we also had this private Facebook group where they were supposed to share their practice with each other, but this ambivalence to sharing it was interesting, because I guess my experience of artist teachers up until that point had been people who were on my course, whereas this were people who had no, didn't have any deadline set by me, so it was. There was one particular participant who was very prolific in her, the work she produced, so she shared a lot on the Facebook group, but most of the others I had to prompt. So they would show me work, they would email me the work rather than put it on the Facebook page, and I would say, how about sharing it on the Facebook page? And that would be, oh, well, I wasn't sure, it's only, they were really lacking in confidence in their own work. And two of the participants had done artist-teacher master's courses and done really well on them. So, this was post, there was two people who hadn't, but And so it was that kind of ambivalence was quite a difficult thing to manage at times.
That care and that nurture that comes with doing the course. It's kind of lacking in what you've described.
Yeah, and I think, what I haven't had time to talk about is what Deleuze, talks about the work of art. It's the whole section in my book about what does the work of art want, and Deleuze's conception of work of art as standing on its own, and thinking through in a crit, that is common in higher education. It's kind of responding to what does the work of art want or need in order to be able to stand on its own and separate from the artist somehow, without the artist standing there explaining it. I've lost my train of thought there.
It goes back to that point you made about the care of the self and the focus on the care of the self, and then thinking more about how does one care for the artwork potentially.
So that sense of, I think artist-teacher courses open up that space where the work of art perhaps has the potential to become something more, and that's why I refer to Claire in my final chapter, because I think in your work, and this is as an outsider looking in, your early IJ'd articles are quite connected to you and yourself, and then as your practice develops and moves on, it becomes something else that is, you can trace back the interests, to those initial, moments. I think you write about becoming a mum and that in your very first paper, but gradually your practice moves away and becomes something that stands on its own through critical reflection and inquiry that, studying in an academic context enables the work to have the perhaps it might not have had without that journey.
Hi Cal, thanks so much, that was great, I really enjoyed it. I'm curious about the idea of introducing creative disruptions to mean that there's different ways of being that sort of kind of allowed in the classroom. And then I noticed you talk about doing that in a careful way, or this idea of care. And I'm really curious about that, because if you're kind of introducing strangeness or different ways of doing things, that can create a level of discomfort which can be productive and becomes exactly what you want. But there's also creating discomfort, and how do we do that in a careful way, given the diverse perspectives that might be in the group? And also, what level of, how much does it need to be conscious? So like the example of the log going in there, there wasn't any kind of conscious explanation that this is what's happening here. And so I'm just curious about a bit of a question.
I'm not sure if when I started out at the beginning that what I was anticipating my participants would do. I guess I had hopes that they would create works that would disrupt the classroom somehow, because I guess there is an ideal of an artist teacher that has come through, probably through the artist teacher scheme and those of us connected to us, that has been about seeing artist teacher practice as predominantly being a disruptive practice. So, for example, I don't know if any of you have read Sherry Horn's IJ'd articles that were published in the early, between 2010 and perhaps 2009 and 2014. I think she's published 3 articles about her artist-teacher practice in the classroom, where she created massive installations and there were performance artists, and it was all about disruption. In Henry Ward's, his practice, the examples that he writes about in terms of his the cardboard maze created in his classroom, it's all about disruption. I kind of guess that I already had a slight problem with that through my role running at the Artist Teacher Scheme in Birmingham, because I was aware of actually how little opportunity there was for my participants to engage in anything that came anywhere near that kind of practice in the kind of schools they were teaching. Henry Ward and Sherry Hall were both working in schools that had a very long-standing tradition of innovative practice. That they were in exceptional circumstances that enabled that to happen. Whereas in the schools that the people that I was working with, they were lucky if they were able to, some of them, to design their own scheme of work ever. They were just having to teach what they were being told to. So early on in my own academic career, I developed this concept called pirate pedagogy, and it was about kind of almost leaving the curriculum aside and looking for those opportunities where there were spaces to kind of colonise, to create disruptive interactions. But actually, in this study, what struck me was the way that a lot of the practice that the teachers were engaging with was disruptive, but perhaps disruptive isn't the right word. It contributed to the classroom in ways that prevented the relation to the classroom being all about compliance. And so Pat Thompson and Christine Hall's work with the TAIL study, they talk about these arts-rich schools where they talk about brokerage, basically. So the notion that the teacher's engagement in creative networks and creative practices provides the teacher with resources that they can then take into school and use with individuals or small groups, so often in quite surreptitious ways, like the kind of, and in fact Zoe describes the effect of her MA, that she'll be emailing her A-level students late at night, after attending a lecture on the train on the way home, saying, you should look at this artist that I've just been hearing about, that there's something special, something about the knowledge that's being shared by the artist teacher with their students is personal, it comes from them. It's not, not just something that everybody's getting, but also it's a kind of, and then Kerry Thomas also writes about brokerage and the creativity as well. She describes it as teachers like using wily ways. She just, the tricks that teachers use to get students to do what they want them to, by saying, well, if I bring in these special paints from home for you that are mine, that I use. So, in my study, some of the participants, they shared their practice with their students, but in after-school clubs. So one had a photographic practice, so she ran a photography club. The other had a printing practice, and she ran a print club, and got the students to print a zine, using various techniques that she'd been learning outside of school. So yes, they're not really disruptive, but I think that the notion of safety became, that because the knowledge was personal to the teacher, it was important that they shared it with people that would respond to it and be receptive to it. So there was this sense in which, I've not read any of Brent Wilson's work on third site pedagogy. I recommend that you read particularly his, I can't remember the name of the paper, but he was an American researcher who came to the UK in the 1960s, early 70s on the secondment, and he worked in Birmingham, and he heard about teacher who had a classroom that was divided in two. Half of it was the classroom, and half of it was set up like a living room with a white carpet and sofa and kind of 1970s style display cabinets, dining room display cabinets around it that displayed his collection of antiques. And particular students would spend up to 20 hours a week outside the lessons in this other half of the classroom with him. I kind of see it as kind of being like an installation. You probably wouldn't have talked about it in those terms. But but there was something about it wasn't for everybody. It was only for particular students. Now that of course ends it up with lots of questions about equity and so on. But I think the notion of third sight practice being this space where there's other third sites in schools. There's PE, there's sports clubs, there's drama productions, there's orchestras, there's other places where other students experience, I think, something different, but the same in terms of those interactions with teachers where they're sharing with themselves from their own practice and not just, that's a very long answer.
Thank you.
Liam.
You've got a few minutes here.
There's many reasons I really like the book. I think one of the most important ones is the way I think it's really honest. I think it's so kind of complex and nuanced again to the artist teacher, and you express your feelings of conflict. So that little passage that you referred to with Julie, where she's talking about just trying all these different things and you feel conflicted about that, and you say that there's something one-sided about playful inquiry, and that it needs to be more ethical and responsible and purposeful. And at one point you say, you talk about the freedom to be responsible. And I'm really interested in that idea because I think there's a sort of strand there, which I think connects to the pragmatist strand of the book, but I don't think it's ever really kind of in the foreground. Well, I just wanted to get you to kind of comment a little bit about particularly that phrase, the freedom to be responsible, and that side of things, and that, or just the idea that there's something one-sided about playful inquiry. You kind of expressed it in different ways. You talked about careful playing and ethically playful playing.
Yeah, I think the ethics of play, first of all, comes through right at the beginning of the book when I talk about some instances, published instances of student practice that kind of has quite a talismanic impact on the participants. And then I also refer to my own experience of, during the pilot study, I wasn't quite sure because the idea of the pilot study was to test the methods and so on. I wasn't quite entirely sure how I would position myself within the situation. Was I just going to be observing? Was I going to be participating in the pilot study? I invited in an artist who I've worked with on the artist teacher scheme to run a workshop with the teachers, and it was simply just a drawing in space workshop. Everyone will recognise it from art school days of drawing with ribbon and string and rope and elastic, three-dimensionally in space. And when it began, I was kind of just sat there and I wasn't sure, should I take notes? And I thought, well, I'll just join in. So I just started. So I became a participant in the workshop, which was fun. But the workshop took place over a week, and the end point was that the artist asked us to just start drawing and write down any thoughts that came to us about the experiences of the week as we started to draw. And I kind of struggled to know quite how to draw, and I was watching the other teachers and they were all really loving it and getting into it, and I felt really self-conscious. And then eventually I started using kind of processes that I'd used on my degree, which was a very long time ago, and really got into it and was quite surprised when the artist that was facilitating said stop, and stood up, and I had this immediate emotional reaction to what I had created. I was completely floored by it, and the teachers and the artists themselves were like, "Whoa, that just looks skeletal." I knew needed to give up my job. That I was barely existing, that I was just trying to do too much. You know, I won't go into all of the reasons why, but I had to admit defeat. And it was, so this kind of, this example of being completely undone by the practice of art making. Now, I had witnessed that kind of response myself several times in teachers at the beginning of their artist teacher courses who had not made art. Like me, I hadn't, you know, although I was writing about artist teacher practice, the irony was I hadn't actually had the time to engage in any practice myself for a long time. Like me, teachers returning to practice, and the first part of it is a sudden connection with the self. You know, to have teachers to start to cry, and you know, always handing out tissues to students on artist teacher courses. And so this sense in which the notion that the play of artist teacher practice is unproblematic isn't true, because you know what I think there is the first thing that it highlighted to me was the responsibility of those running artist teacher courses or events or whatever it is to understand the potential power of the practices that they're asking teachers to engage with. But then also taking that back into the classroom, there becomes a bit of an issue there in terms of professional boundaries, and you know, so another, I refer to another instance with one of the participants in the study. Similarly, was kind of floored by their experience of working with the artist that I paired her with. So, you know, yeah, I probably haven't quite answered your question as you were intending, but you know, that's what the brought to mind. Yeah.
It's interesting you called that an element I had to admit defeat, because to me that sounded like a moment maybe we were trying.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you know, yeah, put it that way. Exactly. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, for sharing this wonderful in-depth investigation of artist teacher practice and the great value that's invested in artist teachers.
You had to read